For those joining us, my name is Sarah Hayes and I'm the coordinator of the 2023 Urban Tree Festival. Thank you very much for attending today. I'm going to hand over in a second to Sarah Shorley from the Woodland Trust, who's going to introduce all our panelists for today, and she'll be hosting today. So Sarah, when you're ready, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the Urban Tree Festival for hosting this 5th in the series of lunchtime webinars. It's great to see everybody filtering through today. Welcome to this 5th in the series of lunchtime webinars. Today we'll be hearing about the valuable and important topic of soil with Vaibhav Nair from Students for Trees and with John Crawford from the Woodland Trust. My name's Sarah Shorley. I'm Urban Project Officer at the Woodland Trust, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session today. Thanks again to the Urban Tree Festival team. It's been a fantastic programme of events so far, and I would encourage anyone who hasn't seen any of the other events coming up to take a look at what's still happening up until Sunday the 21st. There's some great events happening. We will have time for questions today at the end of the presentation, so please do pop your questions in the Q&A. And we'll keep an eye on those and hopefully answer those later. So on to today's webinar. I think the benefits of trees in our towns and cities are really well understood now, more and more so. For example, many of us will have appreciated the beauty of a large canopy tree on a very hot sunny day, but perhaps what's not so well considered or thought about is what's happening below ground and just how important that is. So we're going to hear about soil today from our two speakers. The first of our speakers, Vaibhav Nair, brings a global perspective on soil health. Vaibhav is a student in sustainability and environmental land management at Leeds University, a member of Save Soil by Conscious Planet, and a Students for Trees Council member. Thank you, Vaibhav, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that warm introduction. So I'll be giving you a general overview of what soil is and why we need to save soil. And I'll hand it over to John to speak about urban soils and how we need to protect our soils in an urban atmosphere. So I'll just share my screen now.
Yes, thank you, V.
Is everybody able to see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Right. So I'm here to talk about Save Soil. We've all heard about global warming and how it's an increasing threat. And we've heard about wildlife going extinct or water scarcity spreading. But we never talk about the largest problem that you and I are facing today, and that is soil extinction. Soil itself is going extinct. Now, what do we mean by saying soil is going extinct? You see two pictures here on your left and your right. Let's make this very interactive. So if you can put in the chat, what is the difference between the left and the right side of this slide? Quickly, I'll give you 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What's in the chat? Fertility, organic matter. Perfect. Color. So you're bang on. On your left side is soil, and that has organic content. And on your right is soil without organic content, which is sand. So this is our problem. A loss of organic content turns carbon-rich soil into sand. And to sustain agriculture across the world, we need a minimum of 3% organic content. And in major European nations today, about 70 to 80%, 85% of the soil has less than 2% organic content or organic carbon. So similar numbers across the world. In the US, about 50% of the topsoil is gone. And in India, about 62% of the land has less than 0.5% organic carbon. This trend, like I mentioned, is observed across the world. And this is a sort of schematic map to show you that. So why is this happening, right? As you can see, before, the way we used to do agriculture, we had animals on our farms and we had trees incorporated into our agricultural systems. Whereas now, we have removed the trees and our animals are not on our farms anymore. They're in coops and in large houses where they produce large amounts of methane. So intensive agriculture has led to a mass destruction of global soils. So just to put this in perspective, how much soil have we actually lost already? Any guesses? Anybody wants to say what percentage of soil on the planet we have lost today? Again, in the chat, I'll give you 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What's in the chat? 25%, 70%, 45%, 60%. Okay. We have lost about 52% of all fertile soil on our planet. And that number is increasing at an alarming rate. This is not a small problem because about 30 football fields every minute, right? So that means every 2 seconds, when we say 1, 2, if you play football, if you follow football, a whole football field of soil is disappearing. So the UN estimates that we have soil for about 60 years. And in the next 60 years, we will not have soil to sustain our agriculture, and which means we will have massive, massive food shortages. So why are we sitting in England, right, or wherever we're sitting right now, and talking about this, right? This is a global issue. This should be spoken about at large conferences or something like that. Why does it concern you and I? Let's look at this. Now, number one, acute food shortages. 95% of all humanity's food comes directly or indirectly from soil. And the staggering fact is that 800 million people already suffer hunger today in the world. And that number is reaching close to 1 billion. Now, I want you to understand this. If that number of people stay hungry because of soil extinction, and if that number increases, do we really think that hungry people are going to sit in a corner and just be hungry? No. When people and when human beings, we suffer hunger, we will do unthinkable things, and that will lead to civil wars and mass destructions. As we've already seen in the past, since the 1990s, there have been about 30 civil wars in Africa. And 27 of these civil wars directly relate to acquiring fertile soil. This trend is similar across the world. And we've also seen that in the past, civilizations, larger civilizations, Rome, Mesopotamia, the Mayans in South America, have collapsed purely because of soil extinction. So this is what I was trying to say. Our population is estimated to be around 9.3 billion by 2050, right? And our food production will drop massively if we continue to farm and maintain our soils the way we do. And this drop will not be able to sustain the needs of our population, which will lead to unthinkable consequences. The second thing, nutritional crisis. This is something that's very underplayed and very not spoken about, but this is very, very important. And we want to call it hidden hunger because it is. So this trend, it's true across the world, but let me just give you some stats. About 60% of a drop in the protein content has been observed in Indian vegetables. And these vegetables are exported to all parts of the world. They're very, very popular. Similarly, 87% drop in mineral content in the US vegetables. And across the world, we see a sort of similar trend. So let's answer this question really, really quick. Again, in the chat, if you can. How many oranges should we eat today to get the same nutritional value of an orange in the 1920s? Which is what, let's say, our grandparents ate. I'll give you another 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 3, 4, 4. Yeah, that seems right, but you have to eat, or you and I have to eat 8 oranges today to get the same amount of nutrition, vitamin A, our grandparents got from a single orange in the 1920s. If that's not enough to make you understand the magnitude of the situation, then we will need a lot of work. And as a result of this, about 2 billion people suffer from nutrition deficiency as of today in the world. That's a fourth of the population. So all of us know somebody, our friends or our family, somebody, suffers from nutrition deficiency of one form or the other. And we think it's because it's hereditary or it's by birth. But even if you live in an affluent nation like the UK or the US, even if you eat as much food as you possibly can in one sitting, you will not get the amount of nutrition you need, simply because the food does not have that nutrition. So this is another major problem that soil extinction has led to. Climate change. So this is very popular in public discourse. Everybody's now today, thankfully, everybody's talking about it. Everybody knows. Mostly there are still climate deniers. I don't know why they exist, but climate change is largely in the public discourse. But we often underplay the massive role soil has in tackling climate change. Degraded soils can release about 850 billion tons of CO2, right? And that, just to put that in perspective, is equal to 30 years of humanity's emissions, equal to the last 30 years. So in the UK, I think the average about tonnage of CO2 emissions per person is 13 tons, if I'm not wrong, this year. So you can just see the scale of what degraded soils can put back into the atmosphere if we don't protect it. And scientists also warn that soil degradation is a ticking climate change time bomb, because soil is the largest terrestrial carbon sink on the planet. Yes, it is only second to the oceans, but we do know that the oceans are a very dynamic system. So it is always moving, it's always changing, whereas soils, once the carbon is sequestered into soil, it can stay there for 1,000 years. And just to tell you, and this is not spoken about enough, all the vegetation on the planet, every tree you see, every plant, every crop, if you added the amount of carbon in those crops, that would be less than half of the amount of carbon that can be stored in soils. So healthy soils are the largest carbon sink effectively on the planet. Water scarcity. And a few more statistics for you. 2/3 of the world's population experience severe water scarcity at least a month of the year. And this is already today. This is not sometime in the future. And it is estimated that by 2040, about 1 in 4 children across the world will be living in areas of high water stress. So I want to link this to migration. We know, and it is a very hot topic of public discourse, urban migration, as in rural migration to urban centers. And it is estimated that about 1.6 billion people will migrate to urban centers by, I think, 2050. And 0.9 billion people of those 1.6 estimated, that number, will come from Africa. And this is very directly related to water stress. And water stress, as we mentioned, is because our soil isn't able to hold our water. It's not that it isn't raining. It's not that there is no source of water. It's that our soil does not have the strength or the substance to keep that water underneath and hold it. It is running away. And that is a major cause of concern. Soil biodiversity. So 87% of all life on the planet, including you and me and that microbe and that tree, depends on soil. And I just want to ask you, what do you think is the percentage of life that is going extinct, because we're talking about mass extinction here. Just can we have a number per year? How many species do you think go extinct as a result of soil degradation? I'm talking about species, as in not individual organisms. How many numbers of species go extinct every year? You can put in the chat. I'll give you 7 seconds again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. 50%, 200, 200,000. That's a very, very large range. About 27,000 species go extinct every year. And we're not talking about 27,000 organisms. We're talking about 27,000 species. This is an absolutely staggering figure, and we should all be concerned. And finally, loss of livelihood. And this is a much more, I think, a much more human point to make. Who do you think is the first segment of society and the largest segment of society across the world to be affected by soil extinction? I think it's very obvious, right? The largest segment of society to be directly impacted first by soil extinction is the farmer. So farmers' livelihoods are massively under threat. And why does that bother us sitting in London or Manchester or Leeds? Because the health and the well-being of the farmer is our health and well-being. If he isn't able to live peacefully, if he isn't able to grow the food and maintain a decent source of income every day or every week, then we don't have food on our plate. And if we don't have food on our plate, then, as I mentioned, civil wars and unthinkable things can happen. So I want to touch up on a very sensitive topic here of farmers' suicides. We know that the number of farmers' suicides across the world are shooting up, disproportionately, and we have seen, unprecedented levels of such incidents in the past few years, 5 to 10 years. And why do you think that is? I know in the biggest sort of forums and in the biggest organizations like the WEF and the World Food Programme, the earlier discourse was that this is because of debt and the debt trap and the debt cycle. So the farmer borrows money and he's not able to pay it back, so he takes his own life because he has responsibilities. Do you really think that if a farmer's land could support his livelihood and just the livelihood of his family, if he had a meal to eat, you think he would take his life? I don't think so. So the land isn't able to support them and their basic needs of life and livelihood. And that is causing them to take their own lives. And this is not a small problem, because as we say, even in the affluent countries, they say even one life is too many. One death is too many, right? So you can just imagine the scale of the problem. So I just want to recap all these topics. Soil extinction is a meta problem. It underlies the food crisis, a nutritional crisis, water scarcity, mass extinction or biodiversity loss, climate change, and farmer suicides or loss of livelihoods. So I think I've managed to paint a sufficiently dark picture by now in your minds. But what is the solution, right? Why are we talking about this? And is there any hope? Absolutely there is, because all we need to do is bring land under shade, and not roofed shade, but vegetation, any kind of vegetation. So depending on the context and where you are and what geographical place, the land cannot be naked, right? Mother Earth cannot be left naked. She needs to be clothed. And the only way to do that is vegetation, and vegetation providing shade. So we only have 2 sources of organic matter into the soil, which is what we're talking about. 2 natural sources: plant litter, which is from the leaves and other litter from plants, and animal droppings, which is cattle and other things when they excrete. And what we've managed to do it by today is to remove the trees from our farms, and we don't put back any nutrients into the soil. And our animals are all caged up and cut up and chopped up and sent to different parts of the world. So that's out of the question. So this is what we need to change, right? We need to bring back at least 3 to 6% organic content back into our soil. And this will only happen by bringing land under shade. So what is the Save Soil movement? The Save Soil movement, the baseline, very simply put, is to increase the organic content in soil to a minimum of 3%. How do we do this? 2 ways. One, we advocate for policies across all nations towards soil restoration. And two, we want to raise awareness of this imminent crisis among at least 3.5 billion people, which is, the majority of the world's electorate, to garner their support for these policies. And we've managed to do that. As of today, 81 nations have signed up, and they've vouched to affect soil laws and soil policies in their official law. And we have touched about 3.91 billion people as of today across the world. And this is, I say this with a great pride and joy, because it is so great to see that so many people are taking to this and we are actually getting it moving. Save soil to save the earth. So just to recap all the solutions: neutralize humanity's CO2 emissions. By saving soil, we can increase soil organic carbon. And by doing that, we can sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, put it back into the land, and keep it there for at least 1,000 years. Eliminate world hunger. So just purely by saving our soil, we can feed 2 billion more people. And especially because our population is predicted to boom, we need to be very, very aware of this. Eliminate water scarcity for at least 600 million people. And this is directly linked to soil organic carbon and improving our soil quality. So just by saving soil, we're able to hold the water in our soil. And by doing this, we're able to replenish our aquifers, and our groundwater tables will rise, and this will provide water for so many more people. And we're able to protect biodiversity, because if we don't protect biodiversity, this is what keeps the web moving. And if we don't protect our biodiversity, the whole thing will collapse. So about 87% of life, as I mentioned, is directly linked to soil. And so obviously it is the largest ecosystem on the planet. We need to save it. And finally, we need to eliminate global poverty in rural areas. This is a massive problem, even in the UK, and we need to address this seriously. So soil is the single shot solution that touches the most number of SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, set out by the UN. So there are 12 of 17 that Save Soil directly addresses. And by saving soil, we're able to cater and garner to each of these SDGs. So a conscious planet is the way forward. And that the Save Soil movement comes under the Conscious Planet banner. So it is a global movement to initiate a conscious approach to our soil and our planet. And this is the aim of the movement, right? And as I mentioned, there's been massive support, and we've managed to garner large swathes of people to take to this movement. And it seeks to encourage citizens and leaders globally to adopt policies for soil health and revitalization. It's supported by and it's backed by the UN agencies. So the United Nations Convention for Climate Change and to combat desertification, and the UN, the United Nations Climate Change Agency, Jane Goodall, Klaus Schwab, who is the chairman of the World Economic Forum. It is also supported by the World Food Programme and the UNFCCC and all other major UN organizations. These are some people you may recognize who also support the Save Soil movement. some more. And it is spearheaded by Sadhguru, who is a yogi and mystic from India. He is a speaker, global speaker, and he was named the one of the top 50 most influential people in India. And these are few more people you may recognize who support the Save Soil movement. So let's talk about what you can do, or what we can do. We have two things. Every citizen on the planet, well, most countries on the planet are democracies, and we live in a democracy, right? And in a democracy, we have two things. One is our vote, and the other is our voice. So these are the two things we need to exercise to make sure that soil policies are in place, and we have soil laws that, properly outline what this soil needs, more, or what the soil needs less. And a minimum of 3% organic carbon needs to be maintained in soil. And as we know, we are in the digital age, so social media is an absolute boon. We're able to reach out to billions of people sitting in one place, which was never before possible. So we need to use that, and we need to speak about it, and we need to promote dialogue on soil health and soil policies. You can find us on social media on these tags. I can share the slides, or I can share these handles after the webinar. And we need to do it not just for you and I, but there are many, many, many generations to come. And we are already using the soil of the unborn child. And the time is ticking away. So if we don't do something now, in the next 10 to 15 years, if we try to do it after 15 years, even if we were successful, it would take us 125 to about 150 years to turn it around, right? But if we start now, we can turn this around in the next 15 to 20 years. This is why Save Soil, and this is why A Conscious Planet today. So Save Soil, let's make it happen, and I'll hand it over to John to give you an idea of urban soils. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Vaibhav, for that really fascinating presentation. It's a rather sobering picture, but it's really good to know that there are solutions. And I know from a UK perspective, the Woodland Trust is working on agroforestry with land managers and farmers across the UK to trial planting trees on their land, and seeing some really great results. I'd encourage everyone to take a look at the Woodland Trust website for more information on that. And on a personal level, I've been very fortunate to get involved in my own home city in a food growing project on a biodynamic farm, and seeing and feeling able to be part of some of the solutions on the ground has been really really heartening for me. Thank you ever so much again, Vaibhav. And your presentation reminds me of a Japanese proverb I heard, I believe, in a presentation by the botanist Diana Beresford-Kroeger a few years ago, when she said, to catch a fish, plant a tree. And I was reflecting on that statement, and I looked into it, and apparently it was this saying, which had been known for years, was found to have truth when a Japanese marine chemist discovered that decomposing leaves from trees leached an acid into the ground which bound with iron, and when that iron was washed into the ocean, it fertilized the plankton, which then fed the fish. And to me, and so this really highlights how healthy soil is necessary for healthy life of all forms. And in fact, in Japan, where they've replanted deciduous forests along the coast, fish populations have absolutely flourished and thrived. So everything is connected. On the note of forests, I will now hand over to my colleague John Crawford. John is a conservation evidence officer at the Woodland Trust. His background is in soil science and plant-soil interactions in woodland and grassland ecosystems. Thank you, John. Over to you.
Just check if you can see my slides.
They can. They're great.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Vaibhav for a fantastic presentation about the kind of global significance of soil. And I really wanted to use this time now just to give some perspective on some of the processes that occur in soil, and some of the complexity that's going on, and kind of close on how that kind of might impact on our urban landscapes. And if there's one kind of key message that I'd love to share is that soils are fantastically complicated living ecosystems in their own right, and they're far more than just a growth medium for plants and soils, for plants and trees. So just in brief, what is soil? So soil is a combination of mineral matter, organic matter, gases, water, and microorganisms. And these different components, they occur in different combinations, different types of minerals, and this gives rise to the vast diversity of soils that we see around the globe. This map of England and Wales just gives a kind of a broad indication of the kind of diverse soilscapes we have in the UK. And each of these soils, they can be subcategorized into many different soil types. And this diversity, really importantly in the soil, it leads to huge diversity in ecosystems that they support, and indeed how these soils function. So the kind of the history of these soils, how they've developed, be they glacial soils or kind of sediment-based soils in sort of lowland environments. And each of these, they function in very different ways and support a whole host of ecosystems above ground. And as well as this kind of complexity in soil types, we also see huge complexity in the structure of soils. And this is key to many of the kind of ecosystem services and functions that have been outlined in the previous talk. So this complexity, this often arises as soil horizons. So this kind of bands of different layers within a soil profile. And each of these layers, they kind of indicate the diversity of functions that are occurring, kind of processes of decomposition and weathering, the transport of nutrients, and the access of resources by plants. And within this, we also see this incredible kind of granular structure. So these voids within soil, these we call them pores, and these kind of clumps of soil that form these aggregates. And together, these kind of pores, they create the kind of the space for gases to exchange, for water to be kind of stored and transported around the soil. And this kind of structure is integral to the kind of ecosystem functions that soils have. And fundamentally, as has been outlined, these kind of structures are essentially irreplaceable. They take huge time periods to form, and once they're gone, once they're disrupted by humans, human activity, we're not getting them back. And as well as the kind of the physical complexity and chemical complexity of soils, soils are kind of fantastically alive ecosystems. So it's estimated that about a quarter of all species on Earth live in the soil. And this kind of biological community is incredibly dense. So an often overused stat, but I think it's pretty incredible. It's 1 teaspoon of soil can contain up to about 1 billion individual cells. And this can represent thousands or tens of thousands of species in a single teaspoon. And this ranges from bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and a whole host of sort of plant soil animals, these kind of macro mesofauna. And together these form this incredibly complex kind of soil food web. And the interactions between these, you've got decomposers, you've got predators, you've got scavengers, and all of these interacting together drive many of the ecosystem processes that kind of ultimately kind of responsible and vital for kind of global terrestrial ecosystems to function. So I think a lot of this has been covered already, so I'll just go in brief, but soils are hugely important carbon stores. So they're the third largest global carbon pool after the oceans and the fossilized carbon pool. But really importantly, they are the largest terrestrial carbon pool, so the largest pool on land by a huge margin, greater than all the vegetation, all the trees, and all of the carbon in the atmosphere combined. And really importantly, this carbon is stable. It stays for long time periods, and it's really resistant to a lot of the kind of processes that leads to fast cycling back into the atmosphere. And if we want to mitigate the impacts of climate change and respond to climate, it's simply not possible to avert the worst impacts of climate if we continue to lose soils at the rate we are. The living organisms within soil, they also drive all these processes of nutrient cycling. So thinking about how nutrients are cycled in ecosystems simply is not possible without these kind of plant-soil interactions. So these kind of decomposer communities, these fungi and these bacteria, they convert decaying organic matter back into forms that can be uptaked by plants and other organisms. And without that, we lose kind of the ability for above ground terrestrial ecosystems to function and indeed survive. Soils also play a really important role in our global water cycles. The poor structure of soil that I was describing is essential for how we store water in our soils and how we purify and filter water. And then finally, the living organisms, this kind of incredibly complicated soil food web that I was describing, forms these incredible symbiotic associations with plants. So these can be kind of fungal associations, so these mycorrhizal fungi that colonize plant roots, and they can exchange and share nutrients and resources. They can access and scavenge resources that aren't otherwise available to the plant. As well as these mycorrhizae, you also see these kind of these bacterial colonization of roots. Many of these species, which have co-evolved over the evolution of life on Earth, are not able to function without each other. So I think just trying to describe the complexity of plant-soil interactions and just how many processes are going on is key to kind of valuing soil and how they're kind of inextricably linked to both human history and the future of humanity, but also the future of our ecosystems. And I really like to think of the direction of influence here. So plants, they capture CO2 from the atmosphere and they fix that into simple sugars using sunlight in photosynthesis. And they allocate these kind of simple sugars into kind of plant biomass and their growth structures. A lot of this ends up in the soil through litter decomposition, but also allocation below ground, so creating root structures. And plants can, really importantly, they can influence the soil in order to kind of create conditions more suited to their growth, or to acquire kind of resources of water and kind of nutrients within the soil that they need for growth. So they can create these root systems, they can exude chemicals into the soil that can stimulate the uptake of essential nutrients, and they can also modify the structure and the activity of these microbial communities. But in turn, soil and the soil communities, they can exert influence over the plants. So these microbial communities, they can create plant traits that can promote certain activities, and they can indeed control the kind of the above ground composition of species that can exist. So it's this really kind of complicated two-way interaction between our terrestrial ecosystems above and below ground. And I think that's one of the really key things that I'd love to share in this talk. So hopefully that's given a really broad kind of overview of some of the soil functions and processes at play, and indeed how inextricably linked human activity and life on Earth is to the function and the processes of soil. And I would encourage everybody, when they're next walking around in a system with plants and soil, just to think about what's going on beneath their feet. And I think these images are particularly special, where we see these exposed root systems and kind of eroded soil banks, where we can just kind of get a snapshot at the complexity and the incredible root architecture that's occurring in our grasslands and our forests. So now moving on to urban soils. So I think urban soils traditionally have been somewhat understudied and undervalued. But I'm really glad to see in recent years there's been an increased kind of interest in urban soils, both how they function, but also in the kind of guidance and regulations determining how we should treat them within urban planning. And I think the reason why I wanted to start with talking about kind of the ecological functions of soil is that we needn't think of urban soils in any different terms. Urban soils are integral to our urban ecosystems, and urban soils and trees are a vital part of this. I'm sure there have been some fantastic discussions during this event around the many roles of urban trees in the kind of the value that they have both for humans and for nature. But so I'll just cover these in brief. But over 80% of the population in the UK lives in urban areas. So many people's access to nature is only found in these urban areas, and as such, it's really essential from a kind of a nature equity standpoint, but also from a health and well-being, giving people access to these open spaces. Healthy soils in our urban environments, they provide habitat for wildlife. They allow kind of trees to grow and other kind of vegetation to flourish. And if we maintain the healthy structure of our urban soils alongside trees, we can minimize things like flood risk, increase the retention of water within our urban landscapes, promote the growth of trees, which can improve our urban air quality, provide shade, and also urban cooling. And all of these ecosystem services that soils can provide within our urban ecosystems are only going to become more important as we respond to the impacts of climate change over the coming years. So I think in changing this kind of narrative around urban soils as being kind of almost a byproduct of construction or something that's inert and we needn't really consider, I think really we need to reframe the question, and that they are, for them to become essential components of a kind of a functioning urban ecosystem. And yes, this ecosystem is incredibly impacted by human activity. But once we start to embed kind of urban soils and urban trees within our thinking about how our urban systems are functioning, I think we can get really make really positive changes. So what do we know about urban soils? How might they be different from soils in other systems? So one of the key kind of impacts on urban soils is compaction. So that kind of soil structure that I was describing in the first slides, the pores, the space for gases and water to exchange and be transported, a lot of that can be lost when we compact our urban soils. And this is essential for kind of microbial and biological activity, and also the growth of plants and trees. Once these pores are gone, the soil can't retain the water and it's no longer available to plants. And this is one of the kind of the leading causes of sort of the dieback and the death of urban trees. We also increasingly see sealing of our urban soils, so the use of impermeable materials, concrete, tarmac, which effectively seals and locks that soil away from other ecosystem processes. So it can no longer exchange gases or transport kind of water vertically through the soil profile. And these are the kind of the processes that drive the biological function of soil. So once it's gone, we essentially lose that biological function. Our urban soils are also increasingly modified. So they're dug up, they're recombined with other kind of waste materials of construction. We lose the profiles of the soil, the different soil horizons. The soil structure is gone, and then it's recombined with these materials and put back into these systems. So losing much of its value for nature and ecology, both the loss of nutrients and its loss of ability to support ecological functions. I'd also like to point people to this report. I think it came out last year that looked at the impacts of planning and construction on soil degradation. And I think this was in collaboration with Lancaster University, Lancaster Council and Cornwall Council. And it really opened my eyes to the magnitude of soil degradation as a result of construction and urban development. So the report estimated that about 30 million tonnes of soil from construction sites is disposed of in landfill each year, with only a very small percentage of that being contaminated or kind of requiring to go to landfill. And to put that number, that 30 million number into context, that's 10 times the amount of soil lost from our urban construction than is lost from erosion from agricultural land in the UK, 10 times. And as V has outlined, kind of globally, kind of erosion from agricultural systems is a huge cause of soil loss, but that can be kind of dwarfed by the impact of soil degradation from construction and urban development. Urban development and construction is also driving huge losses of soil carbon. So it's estimated that about 6.1 million tonnes of CO2 is being lost from soil annually due to urban development. And ultimately, we're seeing this incredible loss of biodiversity and soil function from our urban systems. So again, it's a pretty negative picture about the state of things. But as I said, I think there is progress that is being made. Regulations and increased understanding of how to embed soils within our urban landscapes is kind of growing. And I think that can lead to some really positive changes in how we value soil. And if we really value soil and embed it as part of the maintenance of our urban open spaces, and think about soils as being the integral kind of building blocks for a functional urban ecosystem, we can really start to bring trees and bring kind of shrubs and open spaces back into urban environments in ways that's sustainable and can provide so many benefits for humans and nature. So what are some of the simple things that can happen? So one of the key ones is just avoiding compaction. So when we're planning kind of an urban development, thinking about ways of minimizing compaction on certain areas of the site, and also using kind of surfaces that kind of load bear adequately, so that soils aren't compacted by pedestrians and roadways and that kind of thing. We can also use soils that are on site, and I think this is so important. Soils are such a valuable thing, and we're all so dependent on them. And once we start thinking in that way, the kind of impetus is to protect soils and kind of reuse soils on site, and not just seeing it as this inert waste product to throw away. And in doing this, protecting soil structure and reusing soils on site, we can increase the kind of the biodiversity and, really importantly, the resilience and sustainability of our urban planting schemes. So giving trees the conditions that they can thrive in the long term, not just have kind of trees that are planted, but ultimately will die or not be able to thrive. And alongside this is adequate tree pit design. So making sure that the right tree species are selected and they're planted in the right design tree pits, so that they have adequate rooting structures below ground and are not affected by kind of below ground utilities or roadways and that kind of thing. And I think we're moving in the right direction, but there is a long way to go. And I think as we've discussed, and I think we'll discuss a bit afterwards, the problems around soils globally are so vast that we need governments to radically change both the regulations and the implementation of regulations to have systemic change in how we value and protect soils. But it does also start with individuals taking action, both promoting kind of urban ecosystems, kind of soils and trees around where they live, and also talking about it. Start talking to your politicians, start talking to local interest groups about it, and really advocate for change. And in doing this, we can really kind of embed trees and soils back into urban landscapes in a way that kind of will benefit humans and nature. And just to finish, I just wanted to share a couple of images that I took from a walk yesterday. So I live in a small city. It's not particularly well kind of covered in trees. But despite that, there are these kind of pockets of ecosystem and habitat that kind of can flourish. This is a degraded, sort of dilapidated tennis court that I think has been degraded for a couple of decades. But birch trees have grown there, and local interest groups have seeded it with wildflowers. And as a result, this tiny little patch of land in and amongst building developments has become this incredibly vibrant kind of community hub of people going there, litter picking, kind of school groups go there. It's this incredible kind of thing. And you see the kind of the invertebrates, the insects, the birds returning to this little island within the city. And I also took these pictures, and these kind of, if you at first glance, they might look like a functioning woodland, part of a wider sort of semi-natural woodland. But these are tiny, tiny fragments of woodland existing up against kind of motorway embankments or in between building developments. Yet they do retain the soil of a functioning woodland. And many of the kind of the plants and animals can kind of cling on to these little kind of havens within urban landscapes. And these are just kind of left as a quirk of urban planning. Maybe it was in between sort of land ownership, or the land was sloped, so it was too difficult to build on. Yet they're so vital kind of islands within our urban landscapes. And again, small community groups have taken ownership of these. They litter pick and they advocate for their protection in the urban environment and with the city councils. So hopefully that was an interesting overview of kind of soil function and process, and how we can kind of redefine narratives around soils in our urban landscapes as being the building blocks of creating functional urban ecosystems. So thank you, and I'll pass back to Sarah now. I think we have some time for some questions.
Thank you ever so much, John, for that really interesting and fascinating presentation, and also quite alarming, the state of our soils and what we're seeing both globally, but also in our towns and cities in the UK. We've had a few questions in, so we will get to those in just a moment. If anyone else has a burning question out there, please do pop it in the Q&A so that we can ask both of our speakers. But I thought perhaps you'd be happy if I could perhaps kick us off with a question around tree survival and the impact of soil condition on this. Being the Urban Tree Festival, John, I wonder if you can kick us off with your thoughts on the importance of soil to tree survival, and perhaps what the picture might be in our towns and cities with regards to tree survival.
I think it's a really important question, and I think anecdotally this year and in recent years we're seeing increasing reports of kind of widespread failure of urban planting schemes in kind of roadways or other urban developments. And I think this comes down to two things. It's the impact of climate change. Increasing kind of drought severity is meaning that establishing new trees is increasingly difficult. And also the fact that a lot of these soils are so disrupted and so degraded that the trees just simply can't sort of kind of establish kind of functioning root systems to acquire the water and nutrients that they need to survive. And I think generally we don't have a good handle on the numbers of trees that we're losing. And I think it's a really important piece of work that needs to happen, is to provide evidence on this, that we can go to governments, we can go to councils, and we can demand sort of better standards and regulations to improve how we treat soils and ultimately increase the tree numbers in these systems.
Thank you ever so much, John. I think that also it makes me reflect on some of the community projects I've seen happening across the UK with perhaps tree warden schemes who are out watering trees where they possibly can. But I think we've got to start with that good nutrient base to begin with. And that ties in nicely to another question we've received on what happens in a tree pit. Okay, I don't know if you can go into any more detail on what happens in a tree pit with regards to the nutrient cycle, how we can compensate for poor quality soil.
So I think historically there's been a bit of an assumption that when we plant trees in urban landscapes, we need to import topsoil. We need to import a better quality soil, whatever that means. But that isn't really the case. I think once we have a really kind of a well-structured soil and we preserve that, we can retain the soils on site, and a lot of trees will be able to survive perfectly adequately, especially if tree pit design takes into account their needs for water and accessing nutrients within the soil. So primarily this means making sure the tree pit is large enough, it has proper irrigation, it's not compacted. Often in urban environments we get we might call it panning, where you get a layer of incredibly compacted soil, which means that the transport of water and nutrients is no longer able to happen. So breaking up the soil if it is compacted is a really important kind of activity. But I think just avoiding compaction to begin with and making sure that our soil structure is maintained is really, really key. That image that I showed of the tennis court, that is an incredibly degraded soil. It's made up of, building material, broken up bits of concrete, but trees in nature can kind of cling on in those environments. And I think we need to reflect that in how we go about urban planting.
Thank you ever so much, John. And I think one of in my role, certainly at Woodland Trust and some of the cases I've seen across the UK where we've seen often cars parking on verges and compacting the soils of trees in verges, and that compaction is happening widely. So thank you for your valuable insights on that. A question for Vaibhav. We've had a question on what are the first and second largest carbon pools.
Well, I think John mentioned it on his presentation as well, but it's oceans and the fossil stores. But terrestrially, terrestrially, the largest carbon sink is the soil. So, yeah.
Thank you. Sarah, I think we've had a question potentially live from the audience. I don't know if it's possible to
Yes, we've got a question from Jitesh. You can talk now, Jitesh, if you have a question for us, if you want to unmute yourself.
No, sorry. I don't have a question, but I really enjoyed both talks. I think I must have left that on when I was trying to answer one of the questions. Vaibhav's question, when he was asking his questions. I think I must have pressed the button then. But I enjoyed both the talks. They were really good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your feedback, Jitesh. And no problem. Thank you for your comments in the chat and for interacting with us today. I do have another question that popped in a bit earlier, and that was around from JK in the audience. Thank you, JK. It's a question around inappropriate forestation, and JK notes that in the hinterland of New Zealand there was some evergreens planted in an area that was used for where the trees were taking up the water that was traditionally needed by mollusks, and it led to the extinction of those mollusks. So I don't know if both of you, but perhaps starting with John, could expand on the importance of planting the right tree in the right place, perhaps.
Absolutely. I think it's a really important point when we're considering any land use change, is what is the local context and what will be the impact of that intervention. So at the Woodland Trust, we're always kind of grappling this idea of right tree in the right place and what that means. So it also, not only does it mean will that tree survive, but it also means how will that tree interact with the existing habitat and ecosystems. You know, the use of appropriate native trees in the right place is essential to avoid sort of these unintended consequences, negative consequences of tree planting, both for ecology and biology, but also for soil property, soil function, and the release of soil carbon if you plant the wrong trees in the wrong environment. So yeah, a really important point.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it comes nicely to the problem of invasive species, and we should really touch upon that because especially in the UK, I think there are big problems with invasive species, and you would of course know a lot about that being part of the Woodland Trust. And not only that, I think for a particular, like he mentioned, the species interactions, right? It's not. It starts with the plants itself and the trees itself. So the kind of trees and plants we plant in an area has to be from and suitable to that area. And I just want to, if somebody's interested, point you to a global soil policy handbook that we've sort of made. So talks about how do we want to split between all areas across the world. I could link that, or perhaps I could share that with Sarah after, and then maybe we can do something. Or yeah, there's a global soil policy draft handbook that outlines how we want to maintain the well soils. Yeah.
Thank you, Vaibhav. I'm not sure if that's something you're able to pop a link in the chat to. That would be great.
I could just find that. Yeah, 1 second.
Perfect. And I think that on that note of species choice and selection, cities generally are dry, very dry, arid deserts for trees. And so looking at, what are the appropriate species that are going to survive and thrive going forward, thinking about climate adaptation is a massive area for discussion and debate at the moment. We are coming up to the close of our time now, so I think thank you again to our audience. I would just like to come back to both of our speakers for any closing thoughts you'd like to share. Perhaps start with Vaibhav and then John.
Okay, I just want to make this a call to action. We shouldn't go away from this webinar, just in awe and then go on with our lives. I think hopefully both of our talks have touched you in some way, and we need to act on this, not just hear it and move on. So please save soil. Let's make it happen. Namaskaram.
I think I would just echo that really we need to start valuing soil, and really understanding how inextricably linked life on Earth is to the continued functioning of our soils. Yeah.
Thank you so much, John and Vaibhav, for your fantastic presentation, insights and knowledge sharing. I'll now hand back to Sarah from the Urban Tree Festival.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sarah, for chairing today. And if everybody could pop along to the 2023 programme on our webpage and fill in a feedback form, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you all so much. It's been a brilliant talk, and I'm going to end it now. Thanks, everyone.